I'm thrilled to be joined today by Juliette Brody, the director of the Stanford Community Law Clinic, and Christy Laughlin, the deputy director for Contra Costa County at the East Bay Alliance for a Sustainable Economy, or EBASE, and the facilitator of the Raise the Roof Coalition. They will each be joining me and sharing research and updates on conditions on evictions in the region. Specifically, Juliette will be speaking to a recent report on San Mateo County, and Christy will be speaking to conditions in Contra Costa County and recent research. Each of us will be focused on the themes of eviction and displacement in the region, and we will also hear a little bit about tenant experiences in eviction court in Contra Costa County. We will have a short panel discussion and then open up with Q&A. Please feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation via the chat. We're going to try to organize organize Q&A in the chat, but we may need to, prioritize a few depending on how much time we have. I'm going to just show our agenda for today. So we're going to be having a presentation on the preview of the Bay Area eviction study that BAHFA has been undertaking with our research partners. Then we will go over highlights on evictions in San Mateo County 2019 and 2023, and then learnings from Contra Costa County's Eviction Court Watch Report and 2025 updates. Before I get started, I want to say a big thank you to East Bay Housing Organization's team for helping host and organize today's event as part of Affordable Housing Month. So I'd like to hand over the mic to Christina, who's going to say a few words before we get started. And I will stop sharing for a moment so you can have the full screen.
Thanks, Irene, and so great to see everyone. I'm Christina Moon. I'm a board member of East Bay Housing Organizations, or EBHO, and I'm joined here by my colleague and EBHO staff, Angelina Cornejo, and she's going to help me by putting some links as I speak, and also joined by Sophia DeWitt, who's the Director of Programs at EBHO. Since 1984, EBHO has mobilized the power and wisdom of our members to produce, preserve, and protect affordable housing for low-income communities throughout Alameda and Contra Costa counties. We've all been touched by the affordable housing crisis, and we're all too familiar with the problem. We've watched it worsen over the years, but how often do we get to talk about solutions? We know the housing crisis is solvable, but only with a whole lot of people power. We know what we can build when we come together, and our collective power is real. Now is the time to tap into it. Every May, we join our partners across the Bay Area to host Affordable Housing Month, and we are proud conveners of events across Alameda and Contra Costa counties. This is our opportunity to bring the community together to talk solutions, educate ourselves on how affordable housing benefits us all, and ultimately build more support for affordable housing. Today, you're joining hundreds of people celebrating Affordable Housing Month. Please take a look at our event calendar to browse our full series of events. All events are open to the public and most are free. Thank you, BAHFA, All Home, EBASE, Raise the Roof, and the Stanford Community Law Clinic for partnering with us for affordable housing. Today, we celebrate and learn, but after this, let's make sure we take action. You can learn more about the history of the housing crisis by visiting our online learning library called the Study Room, and take a look at our impact report to celebrate and uplift all that we accomplished together in 2024. I also invite you to sign up for our newsletter so you can stay plugged in. There's real work happening right here in our communities, and you've got a role to play in shaping the change that we all deserve to see. Thank you, and again, congrats to BAHFA and our hosts for today's event. Pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Christina. And now let's see if I can get the right screen back up. As everyone knows, this is the hardest part of every webinar, is getting your screen sharing right. So hopefully it all looks good on that end. All right. Thank you again to all of our co-hosts. I'm going to kick things off by starting to talk about, this is very exciting. As folks on this call likely know, BAHFA has not released our Bay Area eviction study report yet. So today is the first time we're going to be sharing a preview of the results. So I'm just going to go over a little more about what the study is first. So we commissioned this study in spring of 2023, so 2 full years ago. and brought on a really fantastic research team led by Catherine Grimond at Centro Legal de la Raza, which actually I think I see Katie on today. Hello. Tara Graziani, Dan Sakaguchi, and Arushi Gupta with the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, and an independent consultant, Alex Worth. So we're very grateful to our fantastic research team. We do expect to be releasing a set of reports in the coming months, including regional reports on court evictions, the landscape of tenant legal services around the region, and finally a report on informal evictions. We will also be releasing an online data tool and 9 county-specific reports. So we have a lot of great information that we're excited to be sharing, and those will be forthcoming over the coming months. You'll see on the right side of this slide, we have a number of different data sources that we've used for this report. For today's presentation, I'm going to be just focusing on a preview of a selection of our court eviction reports. So I'm not going to be touching on the tenant legal services capacity or the informal eviction data today. And that data really draws on unlawful detainer data provided by county superior courts, sheriff lockout data, and locally collected notice data. While we did attempt to collect data from each superior court, we did not receive adequate information from multiple counties. So you'll also see data augmented where needed from the California Judicial Council. And you'll hopefully get to see all of the other data very soon. So to kick things off, we, as of fiscal year 2023-24, saw approximately 21,767 eviction lawsuits filed in the region. This meets or exceeds pre-pandemic levels in 8 of the 9 counties. When adjusted for renter population, Solano, Contra Costa, and Alameda counties had the highest rates of eviction lawsuits compared to their neighboring counties. Alameda, Santa Clara, and Contra Costa counties, as you can see in these tiny numbers that are probably a little hard to see on your screen, but they had the highest absolute numbers of eviction, closely followed by San Francisco, Solano, and San Mateo. But again, looking at rates, you see these as the 3 highest. So as I said, we see evictions matching or exceeding pre-pandemic levels in 8 of the 9 counties. This graph is a little hard to read in terms of the real numbers, but we found it very compelling to show how the dip during the pandemic accelerated again following the end of eviction moratoria, and that we see it continues to climb in several counties. Alameda at the top is the most notable there, when state and local moratoria had ended. Again, that's a little hard to see, so I'm going to quickly go to this next slide, where we can see the same data pulled out for just fiscal year 2018-19 to 23-24 to show that pre-post pandemic rates. So when we look at this data, we see that Sonoma County here is the only county with a lower eviction rate post-pandemic, and that difference is quite small. Most counties, so we were interested in comparing, since this is one of the first times we've been able to have this regional lens, we were interested in looking at, what are we seeing in terms of differences in change between counties. So individually, these counties have all seen slight or large increases since the pandemic, but kind of what the rankings looked like. And while most counties maintained their relative regional ranking to each other during this period, we did see more notable change for San Mateo and Santa Clara counties, who experienced disproportionate increases relative to the region. Because our data collection period was so close to the end of the eviction moratoria in some counties, it is still a little unclear whether the spike in these lawsuits represents a continuation of a post-pandemic adjustment due to temporarily suppressed evictions, or whether we'll see a longer-term trend. And just a note, I'm not able to see the chat in this lens, so if there are any burning questions, maybe someone can, grab my attention, just to say. All right, next slide here. So one of the other, and also just to say, I'm showing a selection of our data today. There's going to be more in our final report that I will touch on, and Juliet will have some more detail on San Mateo that I'm excited for you to see. But I'm just going to show a selection of our regional data here. So across the region, we saw 37% of eviction lawsuits resulting in default judgments in fiscal year 22-23. You'll note there's a slight year change here, and that is due to using the Superior Court provided data rather than Judicial Council data, since there was a slight discrepancy in when we collected that information. For anyone who is on the call, and I see a lot of folks are on the call, so I'm going to assume at least someone doesn't know. So for anyone who is not familiar with the stages of the legal eviction process, a default judgment means that the tenant did not respond to the notification of the eviction lawsuit, and that generally means they forfeit their ability to contest the eviction and that it would appear on their later record. We do see some correlation when we look across all of the different data sources I referenced and look at tenant legal services availability in each county. We do see some correlation between higher rates of default judgments and lower rates of tenant legal services availability. And so generally, we can assume that a tenant who defaulted did not receive legal services, and we're seeing some relationship there. You'll notice here, so these ranges, show San Francisco, where there's a right to counsel, has a much lower rate than some of our counties with slightly lower legal services capacity. We do have 2 counties here in this range. I see a question just popped up, 2 percentages. This is because some judgment calls were required by our research team where there were conflicting data sources, where, for example, the Judicial Council data conflicted with the data that were provided by the Superior Court, which shouldn't necessarily happen because the Superior Court is reporting to the Judicial Council. But based on doing some checks of the data and talking to local legal service providers, in those 2 cases, we decided to represent a range. So there's a very small note that I doubt that folks can see here. And then we also have a footnote in our final report kind of explaining that. This is just one of multiple instances where the data reported was not necessarily easy to translate into a finding. So for folks who are interested in diving deep into the method sections of our report, you'll see quite a bit of description there. All right. Lastly, I want to take a few minutes to talk about some of the analysis we did on disproportionate rates of sheriff lockouts. So we used lockout data for this analysis as it was the only data set available in every county that included zip code data. Consistent with local and national research, our report found that census tracts with high proportions of people of color, households with children, and women faced higher rates of eviction across the region. So I'll read the data on this slide since I know it's a lot of words. Census tracts with majority renters of color were 78% more likely to experience a sheriff lockout than white majority renter census tracts. A higher proportion of Black renters, where there were more than 14% Black renters, were 63% more likely to have a sheriff lockout than other tracts. A higher proportion, over 40% of Latinx renters, were 65% more likely to have a sheriff lockout than other tracts. Female-headed households were 65% more likely, and households with children were 35% more likely. Just a quick methods note, you'll see that there is a slight difference in how we set those thresholds, and that's just due to the way that we looked at kind of where those thresholds would make a meaningful difference depending on the tract. We have many more communities in the Bay Area with very high proportions of Latinx renters, for example, than census tracts with very high proportions of Black renters. So we did have to do some decision-making there about those thresholds, but either way, we can see quite a bit of discrepancy there. A second lens we used to understand disproportionate impacts was to look at the rates of lockouts in MTC priority communities, equity priority communities, or EPCs. And EPCs are census tracts with significant concentrations of underserved populations due to their socioeconomic status or identity. This is a framework that MTC has created and updates regularly that brings together 8 different factors to help our agency understand where there are disproportionate levels of underserved communities. Through this analysis, we saw that lockouts are disproportionately occurring in EPCs in 7 of the 9 counties, except for Marin and Napa. So looking at this chart here, you'll see that in San Francisco, for example, 53% of sheriff lockouts happened in EPCs, while only 33% of overall San Francisco renters live in EPCs. Similarly, in Contra Costa County, we see that even though only 39% of renter households live in EPCs, 52% of sheriff lockouts happened there. So those two slides together, while it's not the same thing as being able to analyze based on demographic data of the individuals who are experiencing eviction, we do think it paints a pretty clear picture in combination with the local and national previous research on who is most affected by evictions to show that there really are disproportionate impacts occurring in our region. I do see some notes in the chat. I was able to figure out how to open it. So yay for getting my webinar skills back up. Hypotheses about kind of why those reporting discrepancies occur. There's a lot here, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. But one of the big things that we did find in the report that I didn't really spend time on in these slides is that our counties, our county programs, our superior courts around our region often use different data systems. They have different capacity in terms of staff to do reporting. There is no state or national requirement around how a lot of these things are recorded. And so the way that one county records something may be different than another. And there may be staff capacity, as many of you probably know from your jobs, is key to having data entry. So that is something that's explored in our final report more, but it's just an overall theme that was one of the drivers of our study in the first place, was just understanding that it's really challenging to get good data. And this is actually I'm at my time, so I want to make sure my co-panelists have plenty of time to present. And this is a perfect segue to Juliet, because one of the reasons I'm so excited about the Stanford study on evictions in San Mateo County is that they were able to obtain much more granular data and therefore can say things that we couldn't, and have a lot of really fantastic findings. So I am going to pivot and pass the mic to you, Juliet, and I look forward to answering more questions at the end.
Thank you, Irene. That was fantastic. Hi, everyone. As Irene said, and I was introduced, I'm Juliet Brody. I've been the director of the Stanford Community Law Clinic for over 20 years. And one of the areas in which we practice is eviction defense in San Mateo County Superior Court. So I'm here to show you the results of the first ever little data study that we've done. As Irene said, ours is, if the BAHFA study, which is amazing, really think of that as breadth across the Bay Area, the 9 counties. This is a study, a sort of mini study, but its assets are its depth. We've got very deep into case files for San Mateo County. So I want to, if I could have the next slide, please. First, I do want to apologize to those of you on this call who have seen this deck before. No new data, no new surprises. So time to, take a break if you've already seen this. But I do want to give a shout out. Stacy Hover, I saw, is on the call, the executive director of the Legal Aid Society of San Mateo County. I don't know if anyone is on the call from CLESPA, Community Legal Services in East Palo Alto, but this was really an effort we undertook on their behalf. And really, we are a trio of orgs in San Mateo County that we really work very closely together and worked on what do we want to know about our eviction defense practice. So I want to really shout out to the folks who are much more in the trenches in terms of high volume practice in eviction defense than my office is, as most clinical programs, legal education programs, we only see a very small number of cases. So if I could have the next slide. I'll say a few words about our methodology before going into the data. So as Irene said, we were able to go deep. And what we did was we actually were able to get access to actual court documents. So everything on Odyssey, all those documents for all residential eviction cases in San Mateo County in 2019 and 2023. This required getting a court order from the presiding judge because we were using one of the exceptions in CCP 1161.2, which, as we all know, importantly limits access to UD records. So we were able to leverage the statutory language for other good cause to let folks see UD records and convince the presiding judge that our practice, our promise to anonymize and protect tenant confidentiality, combined with our promise to make public our data, was good cause to let us get access to the data. So in case anyone's interested in replicating this, stage one is to get access to these records, which you can't otherwise have. The other thing is align yourself with a big research university, because this project would have been impossible without a stable of undergrads who spent summer 23 actually reviewing all of these case documents. And there were, over 2,800 of them. So you need an army of people whom you can train to code the data. And even perhaps just as importantly, get a computer science PhD student who knows how to code things and download things and redact things automatically, because without their support, we never would have been able to do it. So we looked at every single UD residential for 2019 and 2023. As Irene previewed, we chose those 2 years. They were the last full year before the pandemic moratoria and the first full year after the moratoria were lifted. We don't have any data. We didn't look at the years in between. So this is 2019 and 2023, not 2019 to 2023. And I'm going to show you the results in 2 tranches. First, as this slide says, all cases. I'm going to show you the things we learned about all those cases, the 25 or so hundred across the 2 years. And then separately, I'm going to show you a couple slides at the end about data that we were able to see, or results we were able to see if we backed out the folks against whom a default judgment was entered, as Irene explained. So first, for all cases. The number one headline to take from this little study is, what this data show. This study confirmed what eviction defense lawyers know. It didn't reveal any striking new findings. So if I could see the first slide, the next slide, please. This is the total UDs filed. So as consistent with Irene's data from 2019, there were 1,118. In 2023, that number went up to 1,500. So far exceeding the number in San Mateo County before the pandemic, after the pandemic. This is one data point in which we do have the 2024 data. And our data, this CLESPA, shout out to CLESPA, was able to get this. It's over 1,800 in San Mateo County in calendar 2024. That's different from the 1,500 in Irene's slide. And I think that's the difference between fiscal year and calendar year. We're looking at calendar 2024, so it went up even more to 1,800 in 2024, which is incredible. The next slide shows, again, consistent with Irene's, that UD, unlawful detainers, California legal talk for eviction cases. Thank you. I'm so sorry, Nick. Thanks for asking. Eviction cases, unlawful detainer. The next slide, please. So again, this is not going to surprise any eviction lawyer, any UD lawyer, but the overwhelming majority of cases are based on the alleged non-payment of rent. Now, I do just want to pause at this slide for a moment, because while it is sort of the finding we would expect, this is something that was really, really hard to find, because we know what the statute requires landlords to allege in the complaint. If you just look at the complaint alone, you will not see the basis for the termination of the tenancy. You have to, as we all know, flip, and go to the attached termination notice. So this is what those undergrads were doing. So NPR is non-payment of rent, not National Public Radio, non-payment of rent. So we trained the undergrads to flip digitally to the anonymized, redacted termination notices contained in every single complaint filing. And we trained them to bucket them into one of three buckets. We know there are more, but we trained them to put them in three buckets: non-payment of rent, behavior, which is where we instructed them to put allegations about a breach of the lease other than non-payment of rent, or nuisance. I think there is some, as Irene said, some judgment calls. Where do you put a holdover? Is that behavior or is that non-fault, no fault? But we made those judgment calls, and that was the second bucket. And the third bucket, no fault. And I want to remind you that the other difference between 2019 and 2023, it's the last year before moratoria, the first year after, but 2019 was also the last year before the Tenant Protection Act. So the other thing this might be showing us, or we can hypothesize, is about the impact of the TPA on these filings. And it's really interesting to me that the behavior slice, so that's the nuisance breach slice of all evictions, stayed literally the same, 7.1%. There's growth in the non-payment of rent slice, but all of that growth comes out of no fault. Presumably that's because the Tenant Protection Act narrowed the availability of no-fault evictions for landlords. So they waited until there was a non-payment of rent, alleged it that way, and proceeded on that basis. So this was, while it's the most self-evident finding in some ways, this was the hardest finding to get because it required training undergrads about Exhibit 2. But they learned a lot. And I think, well, I'll go on. Next slide, please. Another intuitive slide is this. We did count what tenants were represented and what landlords were represented. This, we have the background data of like the percentages for each of those unique parties, but here, this shows a growth in the gap. That is the cases which we called a mismatch, where the tenant is unrepresented and the landlord is represented. Sort of the typical scenario went up actually from 80% to 88%. The imbalance in representation got worse between 2019 and 2023. Next slide, please. I'm going fast. So you saw the default rates in Irene's data. Here's how that compares from 2019. The 32% in 2023 is a reduction from 2019's 38%. And here again, big shout out to Legal Aid of San Mateo County and CLESPA, who do just enormous work to keep this rate down by hosting county, clinics around the county, helping folks with their answers. And we'll see in a moment the one way to think about the impact of that work. But first and foremost, the rate went down. And remember, that's despite the total number of UDs going way, way up. So this is an incredible accomplishment. So shout out to our buddies in the trenches. Next slide, please. I wonder what it is. I don't even remember.
Did it advance? Okay. Or
it didn't.
Oh. There.
So this I actually think is an interesting slide because we know when we work in tenant protection policy, one of the CAA's, the landlord lobby's favorite policy concerns is, what about the mom and pop landlords? And sometimes that is a legitimate concern. So we couldn't really get at mom and pop. That's not a legal term of art, but we could see what percentage of the plaintiffs, so of the landlords seeking eviction, are a business entity versus an individual, right? So a corporation, an LLC, a partnership. So we asked the undergrads to code that. And you can see, interestingly, in 2023, 25% of all the plaintiffs were individuals, that slice going down. So maybe this demonstrates, a hypothesis is just an increased consolidation in the corporatization of housing in San Mateo County, consistent with trends in other parts of the country. This did involve some judgment calls. Where do you put a trust? That kind of stuff, but we're pretty confident that this number is basically right. So I think that's an interesting one to note what percentage of the total are plausibly mom and pops. And then the last slide on the total, I think this is the last slide. This is just a heat map showing San Mateo County. And unsurprisingly, the UDs, the eviction density is where there's tenant density. So much of that light, very light tan county is green space, is the beautiful hill between 280 and the ocean. Not a lot of tenants in there, although there are tenants on the coast, of course, and they are in the data, Half Moon Bay, Pacifica. But you can see where the density of tenants are in East Palo Alto, Redwood City, etc. So, second and last tranche of data is what happens if you back out that 32% who were defaulted? And can you compare the total set, so all 1,500, to the subset that showed up and answered? And the answer is yes, we can. Thanks to Margaret McBride, who I think is also on the call, for asking this great question. And this was the answer. At least statistically, filing an answer makes a big difference. So I'll show you these 3 data points. 1, disposition. So this is an ugly slide. I get it. When you can see the study, you can spend some time with this. It takes a little while to get, but the top half is 2019. The bottom is 2023. The data are basically, the conclusion is basically the same. So let's look at 2023. So this is based on the court system, as we know, at the end of a case. Well, there's only 4 statuses or stati that a case can be coded. It's either active, stayed, or judgment or dismissal. That's it. That's all that's on the menu. So in 2023, what this looked at the moment that they were downloaded, so at the end of the calendar year, some of this could change. A case could be active, and by now in 2025, its status might have changed. But the moment we grabbed the data, that CS grad student grabbed the data, this is so small, I can't even really see it, but you see the orange slice, those are the cases that have judgment entered against them. And on the left side, so this is the bottom left circle, thank you. You see the slice, the orange slice, that is judgment. That is, of all the cases, what is that, 44% entered in judgment. Look at the orange slice on the right-hand side, down to 20%, if I'm reading that right. That right circle, the circle on the right, is for the responding tenants. So backing out the 400 who defaulted, you can see, now I'm not good enough at math to tell you like what percentage, like someone could do that, but we know if you answered and are therefore in the rightmost circle, your chances of having a judgment against you, and let's be honest, all judgments are for plaintiff. Literally, if you win a demur, it does not get coded as a judgment. Even if you win summary judgment, it's like these clerks in San Mateo County do not know how to say a tenant won a case. All they know how to say is dismissal. So even if you win summary judgment, it's a dismissal. So basically, judgment is for the landlord. Dismissal is usually, at least procedurally, good news for the tenant. So you can see if you answered, your chances of a judgment being entered against you are way, way down. That holds, if we look at the next slide, your chances of getting into a stipulation go way, way up. Now, neither of these data points tells us the content of the stipulation. Was the stipulation great for the tenant? Was it terrible for the tenant? Even dismissal on the previous slide doesn't necessarily mean a win for the tenant, right? You could move out. You could agree to move out pursuant to a stipulation and still have the case dismissed against you as like the thinnest little win that you got is you don't have a judgment against you. But it's really important to remember, not a metric of displacement. Dismissal does not mean that you weren't displaced, and nor does entering into a stipulation mean that you weren't displaced. Maybe it means you had some metric of control over the situation, someone helping you understand it, a CLESPA attorney, a legal aid attorney, a Stanford student helping you and signing that stipulation. Maybe that's better, but it's not a measure of the merits. But you can see on this slide, your chances of getting into a stipulation go up if you answered. Thank you, almost done. 2 minutes. One more slide, I think. Similarly, this is data about comparing the writ issuance. So the issuance of a writ of possession, if you were just looking at 2023, if you look at all cases, oh my God, 43% of all cases end with a writ being issued. Doesn't mean writ executed, right? We don't have sheriff data on execution. This is the judge signing the writ and it issuing from the court. 43%. That's incredible to me. But look, it goes down to 20% if you answer. So that's, you know, a pretty good, I mean, having a writ of possession entered against you is pretty bad. So your chances go way, way down of that outcome. Again, doesn't mean you keep your house, doesn't mean you don't move out, but you're not going to get a writ issued against you at the rate that you would if you hadn't answered. I think that's the last slide. Yes. So I'll just wrap up by saying there's a lot there's a lot more questions that we have, and I'm sure you're populating the chat with them. We are thinking about sticking with this data set and doing another dive this summer. One of the things we're thinking of doing, you saw Irene's slide, one of her data sources was tenant lawyers demographic data. And again, CLESPA and Legal Aid have gathered their data on like household size, household head of household stuff for at least those of these cases whom they touched. So one of the things we're going to do over the summer, I think, is try to marry up that data. It will just be a sample. It's not 100%, but we're going to try and do that. The other question that really occurs to me that I want to know is how long do landlords wait in the non-payment space? Do they do it? Is there anything interesting that the data show about whether they wait 1 month versus 5 months? I have students tomorrow going to interview a tenant with a 3-day notice to pay rent or quit that waited 6 months and demands, you know, $15,000 in rent. Is that, and my students want to know, like, is that typical? And I can say from my experience, like, you know, that seems high. Usually it's more like 1 or 2 months, but I'd love to get back into those termination notices and see if we can figure out how long do landlords wait. Obviously important for thinking about our rental assistance policies and how much money, you know, is there anything to learn about that? Great. Emily says in San Jose, it tends to be 2 to 3 months. That's what I would think. And again, sometimes all these data do is confirm our hunches, but it's nice to be able to tell policymakers, no, the data show this. Most of these cases are based on non-payment of rent. So there you have it. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliet. And now we'll have our third panelist, Christy. Thank you so much for being here and excited to hear about conditions in Contra Costa County and the work you've done.
Great. Well, thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Christy Laughlin, the Deputy Director of Contra Costa Campaigns for EBASE, which is the East Bay Alliance for Sustainable Economy. And I guide our housing justice work in Concord and the county and help convene an amazing coalition, many of whom are here, of 12 community, labor, and faith organizations who believe still in an inclusive, equitable Concord and Contra Costa County where all families can live with dignity and enjoy a sense of belonging. We got to hang on to the vision in these days. Our coalition has been very focused on addressing the housing affordability and eviction crisis over the last 9 years. So I really appreciate all this real data from San Mateo. We know it's been very hard and it's a huge challenge to get data and know what's happening in eviction court. This is actually what motivated EBASE and some members of our coalition to actually undertake an eviction court watch program in May of 2022. And at the time, there was a debate raging about what would the impact be of pandemic eviction protections ending, yet the Superior Court would not provide the county with the monthly data on eviction filings and outcomes. So we got together, decided to try to do this ourselves by attending courts and observing UD cases, again, unlawful detainers, at the county's 3 courthouses to collect this information from the ground up. So I'll be sharing a little bit about that report. You can go to the next slide. And sorry, go ahead. One more. And this report is based on the observation of 56 unlawful detainer trials and some follow-up engagement with the tenants. It actually describes demographic trends in eviction, some not different than we just heard in San Mateo, for about 5 months, from May to mid-October. And this was the period during which the last state eviction protections came to an end. And the report does offer a snapshot of what happened in the months following the ending of protections. Next slide. And as you can see here, I mean, we experienced in Contra Costa an immediate spike in evictions, leading other counties who had some more extended protections in place, a slower, off-ramp. But this report also goes beyond the numbers. It provides some insights and stories about what the actual experience of tenants is when they navigate eviction court. And that reality was eye-opening. Next slide, please. These are some of the sobering findings. Again, this seems to be not uncommon from other counties or nationwide. 86% of landlords were represented by an attorney, as opposed to just 7% of tenants. Black people and women were overrepresented among tenants facing eviction. This is dramatic, 41% of tenants were Black, even though only 16% of renter households in Contra Costa are headed by Black residents. And 57% of tenants were women.
Oh.
And as you mentioned too, a high percentage, 50% of landlords were corporations or shell companies rather than individuals. And for us, this is important because I think Contra Costa sees itself as a little more suburban. Some parts are rural. I think they still very much are wed to the notion that most landlords are mom and pops. So for us, this was significant to have a little data. But behind each of the statistic is a real person who's facing losing their home and possibly homelessness. And this is why we need to understand what happens at court. Next slide, please. One more. Yeah, so I'll just share a couple of the stories that you can find in the report. Our volunteers met a man in Pittsburgh courthouse. The bailiff sent them out of the courtroom to go seek a mediator about his eviction case. This is pretty standard practice in Contra Costa, is trying to direct everyone through mediation. But he couldn't find one when he went out in the hallway. And during that time he was out, his case got called. Since he was not present, the trial resulted in a default judgment in favor of the landlord. Luckily, he returned afterwards. It was explained what happened to him, and he did try to negotiate and got an extension for another trial at a later date, but that still did not end well, and a default judgment was entered. He actually ended up being late because he had car problems, had to take the bus, and arrived 20 minutes late, and the judgment had been entered. Then in the Martinez courthouse, volunteers met a Latina woman who was directed to mediation, as I said, which is common. The tenant shared with the mediator that her unit was uninhabitable, but the mediator responded that the landlord had said they attempted to fix the problem, so it was pretty much a word against word, she said, he said, and didn't leave the tenant with a strong case. But the tenant also told the mediator that she had applied for rental assistance, but the landlord had refused to accept it. And the mediator attempted to kind of excuse this and said, oh, they had a right to do so, when actually this is a source of income discrimination under California law. So the mediator only presented the tenant with a very limited option to agree to an immediate repayment plan over 12 months or vacate the unit. But without the funds, the tenant had no choice but to sign, and agree to vacate. So these are just a couple of the stories for folks not familiar with eviction court. We found that the court watch process revealed that most tenants didn't understand this legal process. Tenants were evicted because they didn't know their rights. They didn't even know sometimes that their trial was actually going to be heard that day. And they didn't bring the needed evidence to substantiate their claims. Tenants we found were signing settlements, but then when talking to them afterwards, they really did not understand what they were agreeing to. And then we saw in several cases, there was no recourse for alleged abuses by landlords, which included refusal to accept rent payments or rental assistance, or to make repairs. And in one case, the water had been turned off for for almost 45 days. So next slide, please. So Betty Gabaldon, who is the person who helped coordinate this court watch program and logged the most hours in court, shared her experience. Tenants arrived alone and anxious, facing the possibility of homelessness. This was their chance to keep their homes, their so-called day in court. But sadly, without any real support, it was nothing but chaos and confusion, a situation that clearly benefited landlords and their attorneys. Next slide, please. So our three key findings from this court watch program are really variations on the same fundamental theme of the need for legal services as the most effective strategy for defending rights and preventing unjust evictions and homelessness. There had been self-help tables at the time, orgs offering some referrals at the courthouse that were not effective. And we found that mediation is also not an adequate substitute for legal services. Without an attorney, tenants who alleged serious problems with their landlords, which might have constituted a valid defense, were evicted. And again, the mediation process doesn't allow for tenants to assert their full legal rights and defenses. Next slide, please. So the recommendations coming out of this report is that Contra Costa should, one, create a tenant right to counsel in the coming years, and in the immediate time, expand tenant legal services. And we do applaud the county of Contra Costa in the wake of this report and ensuing advocacy for actually investing $1 million in tenant legal services annually the last 2 years, though this is still far short from the demand. Two, invest in fast-acting rental assistance that's designed to either stop an eviction or ensure that a tenant has enough time and resources to secure new housing. Many rental assistance programs can be slow and have criteria that preclude folks with eviction notices from being eligible. And again, we applaud the county. There's been progress in the last 2 years to develop integrated rental assistance to secure better outcomes, which has been and a small pot of funds allowed to be used by attorneys representing clients, which has been a game changer. Three, we really, if there's any way possible, we can all think on this, how to really make eviction court data transparent and part of the policymaking process. And then, of course, passing more local tenant protections that are stronger than AB 1482. And as Juliet spoke about, the vast majority of evictions are about non-payment of rent. Next slide, please. But we have a systemic crisis of rents, far outpacing salary increases, and yet we keep treating non-payment of rent as a problem of each individual. You can see this dramatic rise in Concord in rent prices between 2016 to 2023. And we'll say, take even the price of a 2-bedroom, which went up by 31% in just the 5 years. I'm like, how many of us get that kind of a salary increase? So next slide, please. And then in general, again, which is alluded to, I think Juliet hinted at, what's happening in the market is there consolidation. We can't ignore the dramatic shifts in the rental market since the foreclosure crisis of 2008, with corporations buying up rental properties in single-family homes as investments with the goal of maximizing profits for shareholders. We also can't ignore the role of technology in driving up rents with tools like RealPage, which use algorithms to determine the price of rents, which has contributed to inflated rents in many regions. In fact, RealPage has been sued by the Department of Justice for what amounts to price fixing, a violation of antitrust laws. But that was before the Trump administration, so I'm not sure where that's going to go anywhere. But our policies actually need to address these new realities in order to keep people housed. And so on that note, I think, final slide. Even though this conversation is based on formal evictions, as a community, we need to address the crisis of informal evictions, where tenants feel forced to leave after getting a notice because they don't know their rights, see no options, or are fearful. This is particularly true in our experience working with immigrant tenants. And this situation is not getting better in this political climate. So we need, I hope as a community, we can address this need as well, since it far surpasses the number of formal evictions in the region. We hope to address this with more proactive tenant, education and organizing. We need a big investment in trusted CBOs organizing that can actually be proactive in letting people know about their rights before they receive a notice. So I hope we have a whole other panel dedicated to that.
Great. Thank you so much, Christy. I think that's your last slide. So I really appreciate getting to go from the regional lens down to the local lens and really getting to even hear about the tenant experiences as well, which is such an important part of this, to go beyond, these numbers reported, those, the 17,700 and some folks who got an eviction filing that show in our research in the last year are all individual people. And I think that's really important to remember when we talk about data. I do see some questions coming in the chat and just some great back and forth between folks. Glad you're all getting the opportunity to connect. I do have a couple of questions to kick us off with the panel before we go to the group. I see we're, as usual, with webinars a few minutes behind, but that's okay. We'll make that up. And we'll have definitely at least 10 to 15 minutes to answer your questions at the end. So feel free to keep adding them to the chat. So my first question is actually for Juliet, Christy, and Susanna, hoping you can each speak to a different piece of this. So, as was alluded to in the presentations, passing tenant protection policies, whether locally, statewide, nationally, and just generally the types of policies that we know help keep people in their homes, has been very challenging. And it's, even since we started planning this webinar, we recently spoke to additional challenges that folks that we're up against. So I'm hoping that each of you can speak to the efforts you've been involved in and some of the challenges. I know we talked about opportunities in the title of this webinar. I'm so sorry, everyone. We're going to talk more about challenges. But hoping we can start with Christy to talk about, I know some of the recent local protection policy changes in Concord, and then ask Juliet to speak to some of the state policy advocacy, and lastly, Susanna to talk a little bit about federal actions. So if we could start with you, Christy, would love to hear some of what's going on in Concord.
Yeah, well, it's been a couple, I'm not going to lie, it's been a couple hard months for our tenants and advocates, where we had just had some of our tenant protections rolled back and weakened a policy that took us 8 years of advocacy to get last year. We did get a strong rent stabilization and just cause ordinance passed. It was in place around 11 months before it just got rolled back in last month. And the reality is, we have to kind of speak to the elephant in the room happening, I think, to both in Concord and around the region, is that these efforts to roll back tenant protections are very systematic and well-funded by real estate lobby groups. There was the some real estate PACs that actually sent hit mailers and hit pieces against a city council member who'd been supportive and helped us pass it last year, and he lost that election. And the first thing the new council member did within 6 weeks of taking office was to put our ordinance on the table and roll it back. So the rent cap, we had a good a moderate rent, allowable rent increase, and it was dramatically increased to 5% as a flat rate instead of being tied to CPI, which is important to tie rent increases to people's wages, right, and cost of living. And then they eliminated single-family homes from just cause protections, which for us meant almost a third of the tenants in Concord live in single-family homes. So very disappointing. But I don't think we're the only city that this is happening to. I know Marin isn't here, but I know a couple of cities. Marin lost their protections after also passing them through referendum and ballot initiatives that were also funded a lot by real estate industry. So we can it is sobering because we can pass great policies, and we've had momentum, I think, in the organizing movement, and we are up against people with another agenda.
Thank you, Christy. I see Chris Logan in the chat. We're here with a sad face from Marin. Thank you for being here. Juliet, I'm hoping you can speak to kind of the state level. We've talked about right to redemption was on the, just gonna pivot over to you to talk about that a little bit.
Sure.
And if there's opportunities too for folks, if people aren't clued into what's happening at the state, if there's opportunities for folks to support things, please let us know.
Great. Yeah, I'd love to hear on the chat. I know there's a lot going on in Sacramento and the tenant protection, the tenants' rights lobby, Western Center, public advocates. There's a lot of bills up there. I was actually in Sacramento last week testifying, and I want to make sure everyone is aware of SB 436. This is, as Irene said, this started out as a very robust right to redeem. So I was able to work on another project, this one with public advocates last year, learning that 21 states in the country have a so-called right to redeem. So the ability of a tenant to pay the rent owing much later in the process after filing, sometimes all the way through judgment, and be able to redeem the tenancy. So SB 436 started out as a bill. We had an author, a bill to make California the 22nd state to have a right to redeem. And it did get some support, but then in the final, literally in the final hours, the chair of Senate Judiciary decided not to move the bill forward, but offered to replace it with a new bill, same number, SB 436, which now would change to the 3-day notice to pay in CCP 1161 subsection 2 to 14 days. So it would be a really significant extension of the opportunity pre-filing for a tenant to cure a demand to pay rent and prevent the filing of an unlawful detainer. We can talk about, it's obviously not good enough, but 14 days is more days, and it would be 14 court days. So it's actually a longer than 14 calendar days. To connect with rental assistance is really the big push to get your money together if it's at all feasible. So I want to encourage everyone to watch SB 436. It passed out of Senate Judiciary really big, 10-2. And we're skipping appropriations, which I guess is good. I'm talking like I know anything about this. I'm just repeating what people tell me. It's good. We get to skip appropriations, so it's going to next be on the Senate floor. So please watch for that. And I'm sure as I say, this is but one bill. There's a lot of tenant protection activity in Sacramento right now.
And I might just chime in with a few other things at the state level before turning to the nightmare that is our federal landscape. There are some other important opportunities at the state level to keep an eye on, and I see a lot of tenant advocates who operate at the state level in the in the room today, so welcome you to chime in as well. But AB 1157, a bill that would make really important changes to the state's rent cap. That bill is being championed by a number of tenant advocates. It is a 2-year bill now, but it would it would lower the state's rent cap. It would remove the single family home exemption that currently exists at the state level, and it would remove the sunset date for the state's rent cap. So all really important changes. Keep an eye on that bill. There's a lot of work to be done over the rest of the year and into the next year of our 2-year session. There's also a bill that is targeting fees that are levied on renters and how those fees can be weaponized to evict tenants. We can put some more information about that in the chat as well. So lots of activity at the state level, like Juliet mentioned. I think at the federal level, it goes without saying that we are in a hostile federal environment to many of the issues that we work on, including protecting tenants. All Home has been involved with many other organizations on this call and elsewhere, with the National Low Income Housing Coalition, who's been pushing for a tenant bill of rights at the federal level for a number of years. Those efforts are all continuing, though certainly under threat, significant threat from our current administration. Something that I did want to flag, though, more urgently, I think, is the threats that we're seeing with the Trump administration's proposed skinny budget that was released on Friday of last week. Folks likely saw the significant cuts to HUD that are being floated, including, I think we're seeing maybe 40% cuts to housing vouchers. This is existential for all of us, as we well know, but I raise it in part because it does present an opportunity to create a coalition of tenant right advocates, of affordable housing developers who rely on many of these vouchers, and many other folks who can come together to resist these kinds of attacks on the voucher program. So there are, I think, opportunities to seize what is certainly a very scary time, in addition to protecting our neighbors, to think about ways that we can create new coalitions in defense of some of these core programs that we know are under threat. So I'd offer that.
Thank you, Susanna. It is a very difficult time, and just great to have seen so many people. I know folks just had to drop off a little bit for 1 o'clock calls, but just a reminder to see all of these different people on, and just all of the different folks who are here fighting for tenants and for folks who deserve housing, which is all of us. I see a few questions in the chat that I want to make sure we get to, and feel free to add more. Most of these are specific to different research that we talked about. So we'll kind of go back, if you can remember what happened 30 minutes ago. If you had this question, and there's more to it than I'm reading. One is just about kind of the ability to do deep dive studies in other counties, like the work in San Mateo. Juliet, you might have a thought on this. I see a response from Emily. It does vary depending on the county in terms of like the sheer volume, right? So there's a number of reasons that in the BAHFA study, we didn't go to the level of granularity. And one of them is, as Juliet spoke to, the incredible capacity needed to be looking through the cases the way that her student team did. So I don't know if you want to speak to that, Juliet, in terms of feasibility to replicate the depth of the study that you did.
Sure. I mean, one thing I'll say, a couple things. I usually, when I've given this presentation in the past, I forgot to give a shout out to the court staff. And I think a good relationship with the court staff is really important, because once we got the court order from the PJ, they were amazing and really, hi, Emily. They were really, accessible and able to go back and forth with questions, and like, there's 9 cases missing. Where are these numbers? And, so it was relationship and, very high touch, and they were great. So I think having partners in the system really helped as well. I do think unless and until the court system codes cases with more data that we want that could generate reports, the only way to do this is to go through the papers yourself. So I have a meeting next week with, there are AI vendors who want, Emily Hislop is smiling because she connected me. There are people who say, can't you have a robot do this? And, I'm an elderly person who is like not persuaded. I'm very concerned, as I'm sure we all are, about confidentiality, and none of us wants to put tenant confidential data up into the robot, even if they could instantaneously, have done this study. I don't know a workaround for that, but I hope that people are working on that, and I've got a meeting with someone next week, and maybe, they'll convince me that this is safe to let AI at some of these court records. That's kind of all I got.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. And I think we, similarly, some of the data that we received that we couldn't use had some of those discrepancies that were hard to explain. And without having strong relations, in some cases, it was the lack of like capacity of staff or a relationship or merely that, maybe the data was too old. We tried to collect data back to 2000 and, the staff have changed, the systems for data collection management have changed. It's very hard to do over long periods of time given that too. So, but I appreciate the comment because it's really speaking to the need for this information. And we know this is something that folks have been asking for more data in local jurisdictions to MTC. A couple questions on the let's see, I see this one came up a lot. Were LLCs, so this is Juliet also speaking to your study in looking at the LLCs, was there a check to see if the LLCs were a single member with a person versus a corporate entity member? Can you speak a little bit to that? And
yeah, I saw that
yeah.
question, and we didn't cross-check the entities who were identified with the Secretary of State data to see like who are the members. It's a great point, and I'll put it on my list of things that we might want to do with this tranche of data. It wouldn't be that hard given how we've got it. So I think that's a great point. Thanks for the question.
Great. And then
Juliet,
I also see
I just
go ahead.
add really quick,
please,
because
Emily.
you talked the one thing that the AI could be used to do is to do that task, because that's publicly available data. So that's
great.
Just a follow-up.
Great idea.
Yeah, and I see related to all of these data questions, Ugo put a great comment in the chat here that the Superior Court system is under-resourced and needs resources. Just got upvoted a lot. This is going to be one of the big findings from the Bay Area eviction study that BAHFA is putting out, is like, this is, rather than trying to do quite as much on a piecemeal basis, like obviously some things need to be done locally. There are very important relationships that are built locally. But in terms of collecting and maintaining data systems, the California Judicial Council does already collect and maintain data for the entire state. So focusing there could be one way to be a little more get better data. I saw a question around supporting good pro-tenant candidates. I thought, Christy, this might be a good question for you. Around, especially given what you've seen in Concord, what, you glossed over this, but spending 8 years working toward policy, I know there was a lot you did around candidate support. So curious if you can speak to that a little bit.
Well, I think we need to do more of supporting our courageous candidates who are out there and digging some more up, willing to stand for tenant protections. And certainly we did support someone who came into office, and which is why we had our 3 votes in Concord. We supported them on our own time. So that's what helped push us over the edge after 8 years, honestly, right? We could do all the great advocacy in the world with lots of tenants activated. Over the years, we had, proof of the economic displacement crisis in our housing elements. We had the data, had the stories, And we still now need candidates, right, who are going to stand by these, make these commitments. I mean, I'd like to see, this is, you know, maybe a movement kind of where we actually, you know, have candidates like take pledges not to take real estate money, right? And I think that it feels important in our Bay Area context, especially when so many cities have tried to pass these efforts, right? And they've been pushed back or replaced by other pro establishment, shall I say, candidates.
Thank you. Yeah. And this is, I see, I have one last question I'm going to put out, but if folks have another, I think we have 2 more minutes, so we're really at the end, but if there's any burning questions people have, feel free to put one last one in the chat. I see a question from Suzanne Moore about the increase of evictions for non-payment from when there's the management is used, there's a third-party utility service. Have others have seen that? This came up in our qualitative data in the Bay Area eviction study, but I'm curious if Juliet and Christy, if there's anything you want to say about this.
I can't say anything from the study, but I can just say from my little data set of my own practice, I've seen a lot more cases with a lot of utilities being characterized as rent and demanded in 3 days from vendors, and impossible to get discovery on the basis for them, and it's a real problem.
Yeah, I mean, our tenant organizing too, we've seen the same, more of an increase over the last, I'd say, 4 years of, yeah, these third-party folks charging for utilities. And it's very challenging to address. You know, we think we've, you know, tried to, that's why some of these ordinances do matter in saying, defining what rent is, right? And making sure that it's seen that any other subsequent rent increases and, you know, are basically violations of rent of the ordinance. So it is an issue and a growing trend.
Okay, well, with that, we are just about at time. I want to thank everyone again for attending. Thank you to our co-hosts, Allhome, EBHO, EBASE, and Juliet with Stanford Community Law Center. Really encourage you to look up both of the reports they just talked about. We will be sharing out our reports when they come out, and we'll have a webpage on BAHFA for you to check ours out. But if you are a local jurisdiction and haven't seen them yet, my counterparts at the Housing and Local Planning team at MTC just put out some great resources on protection policies that I linked in the chat too. You know, just great to have this space with you all in these difficult times and to get to just get to share space. So thank you for all your time today, and we will hopefully talk all again very soon. Thanks.
Thanks, Irene.